There is no playbook, there's no blueprint for that. If you're doing something that's genuinely individual and unique and innovative in the market, you're not doing what everyone else is doing.
Like, we're not boring, we're not crazy either.
If I'm sat on the sofa of an evening flicking through TikTok, I'm there to be sold to from a B2B brand just as much as I am a B2C one.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
It's amplification of values, I think, is what it really brings
And that's
together.
beautifully put, yes. Yeah. Amplification of values, I'll remember that.
You can say to a consumer, we need you to act, and we need you to act now based on how the weather looks outside.
Yeah.
That just simply isn't a conversation that's going to happen in a B2B industry.
The purchase you're often making on a B2B level could be spending millions and millions on a machine. Well, that's a long thought out journey, making that decision, where the decision to go to the pub for a pint is a quick one made on the spur of the moment.
This could be quite controversial, really, couldn't it, in some ways?
Welcome to What's Got the World Talking, the podcast that delves into what's on the minds of the marketing, PR and social media world. In this episode, we're exploring the relationship between consumer and B2B marketing. Two disciplines are often positioned as opposites, but are increasingly overlapping in how they think, create and deliver impact. Is consumer marketing really more creative and reactive? With B2B, its more serious, rational counterpart? Or is that distinction outdated? From creativity and strategy through to audiences, influencers and evaluation, what can each side learn from the other? And what happens when traditional lines blur? I'm joined by Associate Creative Director Dan Gabriel and Associate Director Rob Jones as we discuss the misconceptions, the opportunities, and ask whether B2B and consumer are really that different after all. So I know you've appeared on the podcast before, but you want to start by reintroducing yourselves.
Yeah, I'm Rob, Associate Director here at WPR, predominantly on the B2B side of our business.
And I'm Dan, Associate Creative Director at WPR, so working across both consumer and B2B.
Well, welcome and thank you very much for coming back. So today we're going to discuss all things B2B versus consumer marketing. I think we're really lucky at WPR that we've got clients that span an enormous range of sectors, from retail to leisure to engineering, manufacturing, construction. So we get to work with marketing teams in all walks of life. So let's set the scene before we go into the detail. If we're talking in really broad strokes, do you think it's fair to say there's a tendency for people to view consumer marketing as more creative, more fun, and B2B as its more serious, perhaps rational counterpart?
I think it's fair. I think that's a valid assumption. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we'll go into the reasons behind some of those assumptions as well. Do you agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think there's definitely some truth behind that. It's not to say that that is exclusive to every B2B or consumer brand. I think we are starting to see a shift in the landscape, and I think there's a lot of the cues that come from consumer that are starting to span into the B2B space, and vice versa, actually. I think we're starting to see a bit more of a blurring of the lines, for sure.
So you don't think that there's truth to those assumptions, but they're not set in stone. They can.
Yeah, I think that this industry, the landscape that we operate in, it's changing all the time, isn't it? And like Dan says, I think I think for a number of years we've kind of maybe fallen into a bit of an assumption that sort of B2B follows B2C, and we see trends come through the B2C markets that then get introduced to those kind of B2B brands and the sectors they work in. But I think like Dan says, I think there are instances now that we're seeing where the opposite is happening as well, and things are working both ways. Yeah,
I'd agree with that. And what do you think the biggest misconception marketers on the other side have about what the other does?
Mm-hmm. This could be quite controversial, really, couldn't it, in some ways? But I would say probably the biggest misconception from consumer side for B2B is that B2B is very functional and, dare I say it, boring. It absolutely doesn't have to be boring, and that is it's very subjective, isn't it? Because it's like if you're talking to a consumer marketer, they are thinking in a consumer mindset, and something that would be interesting to them might not have the same sort of interest levels. If you were talking about a very technical manufacturing engineering product to a consumer, of course, it's not going to be interesting. So I think there is probably an assumption that B2B is more functional in terms of the delivery, which I would potentially challenge.
Yeah, I think, to flip that, I suppose the perceptions, I think, from the B2B side into the B2C side is maybe it's sort of often creativity at the expense of sort of substance and business impact.
It's frivolous.
Yeah, a little bit more frivolous, a bit more shallow,
Bit fluffy.
potentially, a bit fluffy. Yeah, exactly. So I think, we hear these words sort of get thrown around, I suppose, as stereotypes quite a lot. Do we think they're completely fair? No, I would say. And I would apply that to both sides.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like like we're not boring. We're not crazy either.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We're all just doing a really good job for marketing teams and delivering the results we need to. So I suppose taking that into account, Rob, where have you seen the most creativity in B2B marketing of late?
I think we're seeing now creativity, particularly on social, really come to the fore within the B2B space. I think for a number of years, particularly B2B brands looking to sell a product or service, we were kind of maybe a bit guilty of being beholden to editorial policies. The media will say, oh no, you can't talk about that product. That'll be seen as advertorial, or that's too salesy a message. So I think we potentially, as a result of that, almost shied away from, well, we can't actually talk about the product that we want to sell, which is a bit of a false economy potentially. I think what the sort of social channels and the, I suppose, algorithmic preferences on those social channels have led us towards is very people-oriented content. We can promote product. We can promote product in a humorous way, a creative way, a more dynamic way, and I suppose less of a what's the word I'm looking for? I suppose less of a formulaic sort of way as may have been seen through traditional kind of editorial PR practices.
I think it's sort of going back to that functionality point as well. I think it can become very easy for marketers on both sides to fall into the trap of focusing on product USPs and specification and not really thinking about the value that it unlocks for the customer. And I think more of those kind of emotional territory marketing tactics that really tap into the human truths, I think, are starting to span into the B2B space a little bit more. So we're not defaulting to just talking about the product, and we're starting to really think about how we entertain the audience, how we build trust, how we kind of tap into their sort of wants and needs more impactfully across the channels that we're operating across.
I think that's it. The old adage, people buy from people, has always come into play within B2B. And I think whereas before that used to manifest itself through thought leadership, which I think still has a really prominent place in the kind of comms mix, we're now seeing things like employee-generated content come through on social, using a lot of third-party testimonials, spokespeople from our clients' customers, for instance. So that human kind of connection that Dan's referred to there, I think, has become a real mainstay of everything we do on B2B now. And I think with that we do need to apply kind of a creative mindset to that, to make sure that even within that space, the formats don't become too kind of copy and paste and formulaic.
Yeah, you're still selling to people, like fundamentally, whether it's machine components or trainers, the fundamentals of marketing still stand, whether it's a B2B or a consumer audience. And I think having that people focused lens on creative and really understanding the human truths, whether it's the pain points of customers or whether it's how we kind of entertain and engage an audience beyond just product and commercial messaging, I think the two sort of straddle each other really.
Yeah, I think they're excellent points. So tackling the reputation that your area of specialism has of just being wacky or overly creative, can you think of any brands that you think, yes, their creative is really good, but I can see a really solid strategy, a good functional purpose behind the campaigns that they're putting out?
I think a really good example of a brand that has identified its strategic response and really delivered is Aldi. I think Aldi has developed a really clearly defined brand persona and tone of voice, and I think it has maintained consistently that persona to market. And as a result of that, it comes across as a very confident brand. It really understands its audience, it understands its customer base, and it has delivered it consistently over time. And that longer term brand building has really paid dividends in terms of commercial impact.
I agree. We are super fans of Aldi, and thank you for not mentioning Marks and Spencer's or M&S, because that's usually what is all over these podcasts.
I was going to, but
good to have a change from the norm. And Rob, do you often face reluctance from B2B marketers to be creative, or a misunderstanding of what that means?
I don't necessarily think it's a reluctance, but one thing I do think plays a part in this, I think, over the last 10 years in particular, probably way longer than that, the level of access that we have to performance metrics and the expectation, I think, a lot of the time for B2B brands to link their marketing efforts directly to the sales funnel, I think means that there can be a degree of reluctance on the grounds that if you're going to spend your budget, you're going to spend it on the long-term brand building activity that maybe requires a bit more creative thought and creative execution, or the short-term kind of performance delivery, which puts website traffic on the table, it puts sales leads through the funnel. I think sometimes it comes down to that. So I think, often people, I still like to think that a lot of the sort of, CMOs, marketing directors, marketing managers, they're in their roles because they like the kind of creativity that can come with it. But there's also pressure around that boardroom table as well to deliver those kind of KPIs for the business too.
There's perhaps more of a focus on short-term gains versus long-term brand building efforts within B2B marketing teams. I think one of the other challenges you have is often you'll be working with a smaller marketing function within a B2B organisation. That's not the case for every company, but certainly, some of our consumer clients, we've got marketing teams of 40, 50 people, whereas on the B2B side, you might be working with a marketing team of 2 or 3, and they'll be reporting directly into the CEO or the managing director. There is more of a grasp or an understanding, I think, in some consumer brands of the longer term benefits of brand building activity and how that can really help support the shorter term gains and the more conversion based activity that you might be talking about.
Yeah, I'd massively agree. I think if we think into our client base, there's one client I can think of in particular in the construction space who, they have a team headed up by someone who's from a brand background, a head of brand, and the conversations we have, fascinating. Love having the conversations that we have about that consistency of connecting the brand with customers at the right times. And I think it's really refreshing when we have those conversations. But like Dan says, not every B2B organisation has the sort of is fortunate enough to have someone that sees that sort of the importance of the long-term investment in brand. And I think that's maybe where one of the big challenges we face lies.
I think the other point I would add is it's probably fair to say that some B2B marketers are a little more risk averse, I think, than consumer. And I think it's difficult. I've used this analogy in previous podcasts, but we hear a lot about disruptors and we want to disrupt the market. And I think it's a really it's a risky thing to be talking about, because there is no playbook, there's no blueprint for that. If you're doing something that's genuinely individual and unique and innovative in the market, you're not doing what everyone else is doing. It's that sort of distinctiveness that is really hard to quantify what the impact is going to be, because it hasn't been done before. So I think there is perhaps a little bit more risk aversion within the B2B space, because nobody else is doing something. It's really hard to then take that to the C-suite and say this is the direction that we need to be taking the business or the brand.
But it's a very different market, very different challenges, because the purchase you're often making on a B2B level could be spending millions and millions on a machine. Well, that's a long thought out journeys making that decision, where the decision to go to the pub for a pint is a quick one made on the spur of the moment. So that is reflective, I think, in certainly how we approach briefs and how our marketing teams think. It's very different challenges.
I think different challenges involving a more complex ecosystem of decision makers as well. I know, we use the example as a bit of a flippant one, but I can go down the high street and buy a pair of trainers on a Saturday afternoon. That's just on me. That's down to me. What I want to buy for my own personal gain, I suppose. If you're looking at spending £500,000 on some industrial machinery, there's people involved in that from right at the highest level. There's the people on the factory floor. There's the people in procurement, in sustainability and ESG. And we've got to be, I think, in our sort of the work that we do with our clients, we've got to think quite carefully about which messages resonate with which parts of that decision-making network as well.
I think it's understanding the purpose of each channel and the role that it plays in that decision-making process as well. And I think certainly on the consumer side, I think consumer marketing teams are quite good at understanding the role of organic social, for example, in terms of building community and generating brand affinity, and not using that necessarily as a place to sell. Ultimately, it's gonna impact your results. It's gonna drive down your performance. It's not gonna build that longer term brand equity. And I think we can be guilty of sometimes defaulting to a sales message or a product USP in those spaces, when actually, people aren't going to click a Facebook post and buy a £2 million machine equipment for a business.
We wish they did.
But then might be, well, exactly, yeah, we'd all be doing it if that was the case. So it's really understanding the channel mix, the content ecosystem, and the messages that we're delivering to those audiences across those different touch points to make sure that we are building the brand in the right way.
So I know we've touched on audiences briefly already, and how B2B people buy from people. Is there the distinction that there used to be between people's personal and professional lives, and are you talking to the same person or different personas in that regard?
I think the lines are blurring massively, or have blurred massively. I think we all know it ourselves in our personal and professional lives. If I'm sat on the sofa of an evening flicking through TikTok, that there is, in a sense, I'm there to be sold to from a B2B brand just as much as I am a B2C one.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And I think if the content's positioned in the right way, and I think this is the key, isn't it, is making sure that I don't feel like I'm at work if I'm scrolling through my social feeds, because the content's engaging, it resonates with me. I'm maybe still thinking about some of the challenges I'm facing at work that day, that week, that month, and seeing content at the right time doesn't necessarily have to be within the 9 to 5, that really kind of hits the right note. I think can really make a massive difference in really capturing an audience's imagination.
And similarly, we're seeing consumer brands do great stuff on LinkedIn.
Absolutely. LinkedIn provides a unique environment for brands like Surreal, because it's seen as a professional platform. They're actually using it to really drive and build that engagement with a community in an unexpected environment. I think, I suppose to agree with Rob's point, really, I think the fragmentation of the media landscape is something that we're seeing across both consumer and B2B. And it means that content can't just live and breathe in one environment anymore. It has to span multiple channels, multiple ways of reaching those audiences. So it's about kind of thinking about your creative in a channel agnostic way, and really using the different platforms, the different kind of forums for reaching your customer base, and also thinking about the unique ways to kind of interact and engage with them on those platforms. I think consumer marketing is quite good at participation. I think B2B is perhaps a little bit more broadcast at the moment, and I think there are ways that B2B can do more to really bring their customer into their brand world and use it as an opportunity to build that community as well.
Yeah, I agree with all that. So let's talk about content creators / influencers for a while, because I know it's it forms a huge part of consumer marketing now. Are we seeing B2B brands turning to the content creator route more? I know linked influencers are a thing.
I think, we're absolutely seeing more and more brands look to influencers in sort of specialist B2B sectors now. I think one of the things that I think has really come to prominence, and we keep coming back to, I think, in every episode, is AI and this need for real human connection, trust signals, authority, credibility. And I think what content creators can do in the B2B space, just as much as they can in B2C, is show there is demand for a product that is real. There is tangible benefits to a product, be that on a factory floor, be that in a leisure facility. I think there is a degree of, we've seen it before with other kind of media trends and so on, that B2B's maybe been a bit slower to embrace the creator space. But I think the reality is, content creators, it's become a profession in its own right within the consumer world. Whereas within B2B, I think we're seeing influencers who are they have an employer whose professional kind of interests, reputation they have to bear in mind as well. So I think we're seeing it certainly shift in that direction through that need and that demand for more human connection within the B2B environments we work in.
So on the consumer side, I think brands can continue to plough ever more money into their work with content creators. You're not seeing any decline of that trend, are you?
Yeah, creator marketing in the consumer space continues to be huge. I think fundamentally the same principles for consumer creator marketing apply for the B2B space. It's about building trust signals. It's about peer-led endorsement, about kind of driving third-party recommendation for a brand or a product or service. And we're seeing that absolutely translate into the B2B space. One of our, we work for a boiler brand, and heating and hot water engineers are absolutely huge on TikTok. So we've done a huge amount of work working with relevant creators in that space and actually driven a huge amount of visibility, reach and engagement around more sort of B2B led messages, but focusing on those individuals working and operating within that sector. So you wouldn't necessarily think that TikTok would be the first place to go for that sort of market, but there's absolutely demand there. And I think it's about really kind of identifying where the audience is and where the opportunity is for your brand. And yeah.
Are we going to see more AI influencers on consumer? Might it creep into the B2B space?
I like to think not. I hesitate because I think it feels like a never say never type answer, but I'd really like to think not. I think, we talk a lot about credibility. I think particularly in the professional world, the B2B world, where your professional reputation is at stake, both as an individual and potentially as a brand as well. I think there's a lot on the line for those that kind of go down the route of AI generated influencers, creators, etc. In the same way that we're speaking to clients now about the risks associated with AI generated content from a written editorial standpoint as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if your content creator, your influencer is fed by the machine or is fed by a brand voice, then it takes away those trust signals, which I think are really important with any kind of creator partnership. We talk a lot about authenticity, and I think that value exchange is really important. You're going to trust someone who's real and not someone that's generated by AI.
I agree with that. I think the other thing that I guess sort of sprung to mind when you were talking through the sort of content creator and that market is there is a degree of influence there. Of course there is, but there's also the element of user generated content that brands can get from working with influencers as well. I think we've certainly spoken to brands in the B2B space and almost seen influencers and creators not solely as being a channel to use for the influence they have with an audience, but actually as a source of user generated content, which we know lands extremely well across all of the social channels in 2026 and has done for a while now.
Yeah, it's far more compelling to have a third party delivering a message to an audience than just the brand voice. I think it can land with more impact when it's built from a third party source. It helps to build those trust signals for sure.
So moving away from content creators, that was very interesting. And turning our thoughts to PR, do you think that B2B marketers have more of a long-term view of corporate reputations than consumer brands do, or is that a hideous overgeneralization?
I don't necessarily think it's an overgeneralization. I think rooted in B2B, I think there's some trends, some common themes we see. I think we tend to see senior marketers stay in role in post for longer within B2B. I think that's probably fair to say.
We'd agree with that, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I think as a result of that, you do get that continuity. So you do get that consistency applied to reputation management, brand building, some of the stuff that we spoke about earlier. I don't think it's, I wouldn't suggest, I don't think there's a degree of B2C brands viewing it as less important as such. But I think there's a lot more moving parts potentially in those consumer markets at times than there are, and the channels that we operate on as well, than there are in the B2B space.
So staying along that vein, are consumer brands potentially guilty of pursuing campaign spikes at the risk of brand building solidly over time?
I think the most impactful brand strategies maintain that consistent tone of voice and steady drumbeat of messages to market. I think you can find that brands fall into the trap of doing a one-hit wonder, a spike of activity, and then falling off the radar completely. And I think where we see that consistency in delivery of the message, that's where it has the most impact, because you're reinforcing the messaging in the mind of the consumer and you're building those trust signals over a prolonged period of time. And that can in hand support your more sales-based messaging, because you're really creating a fertile ground for the customer to purchase from you versus competitor.
I'd agree with that. You need both, don't you? Yes, campaign spikes are great for creating noise, delivering action at critical trading periods, but you also need to have that kind of ongoing PR and wider marketing mix of channels to create that sustained brand awareness. And I think that's the same across both B2B and B2C, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think in both sides and all markets really, you have inevitably got brands operating in markets where there's seasonal demand, for example. And that could be something as simple as, financial year in the B2B space. But I think going back to the point earlier around, misconceptions or perceptions, I think sometimes from the outside looking in, there are certain B2C brands who it can look like they kind of go all out with one big campaign and then maybe neglect the sort of steady drumbeat in between campaigns. And I think maybe that's where certain B2C brands could learn a little bit from B2B, where maybe there's accusations that the steady drumbeat overrules the sort of, the fireworks, as it were, and the spikes of activity. I think that, like Dan says, there has to be an element of both.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to the challenges facing marketing teams of this considered purchase versus this sort of spur of the moment purchase, that the weather's out, you've got to get people down to beer garden, it's going to rain this weekend, calm it down. It's such different challenges facing both teams, isn't it?
Yeah, and like you say, the speed of decision, it varies massively between the two. You can say to a consumer, we need you to act, and we need you to act now based on how the weather looks outside.
Yeah.
That just simply isn't a conversation that's going to happen in a B2B industry.
It's also really worth considering the channels you're operating across, where your consumer, like brand, where consumers are discovering brands and discovering content. And I think it ties into the GEO debate, doesn't it? It's about having that frequency and relevancy of citations across the entire internet, and making sure that your brand is maintaining that visibility. So you are showing up in the searches, but then also having those spikes of activity strategically placed around when consumer search demand might be peaking around a certain product or topic. So it's about making sure that you have the combination of both to really drive impact.
And does PR play a different role in B2B and B2C, or is it similar?
I think the fundamentals of PR are similar. It's about building trust, long-term advocacy for a brand, and creating that visibility and exposure. It's the role that PR plays in the wider marketing mix as well, in terms of supporting the other channels and creating narrative and content that lives and breathes across different content streams ultimately. And I think that is the same whether you're marketing to a B2B audience or marketing to a consumer audience.
I think one of the things I've found very refreshing actually over the last 5 years, certainly, the definition of PR I think now isn't restricted to media relations and press coverage. I think as a result of that, I think we're seeing more brands, but on both sides, B2B and B2C, apply that sort of channel agnostic approach that Dan referred to earlier. We're seeing that message spanning multiple channels, be that social, be that website, own channels, be that the media as well. And I think that's allowing us to be much more agile with the strategies we put in play for clients.
I agree with that. I feel like we've got to a point in marketing where channel neutrality isn't just a nice to have, it's a must have. And I think it's been really nice to see the role of earned media, and I think it's really sort of earned its place at the table now. I think marketers are starting to recognize the value that it can add to a business in both the long and the short term, and the impact it can really deliver for an organization at a really high level in terms of shaping narrative, in terms of building the perception of a brand and really driving tangible impact for businesses. It's not just seen as the afterthought that's just the bolt on at the end of the day. It really has sort of earned its seat at the table, which I think is really nice to see.
So let's talk about evaluation for a moment, and how marketers prove to their businesses, whether it's a consumer or a B2B business, how they demonstrate the impact of their marketing activity. Is there a difference, do you see, in the way marketers ask you to evaluate and report onto their business?
Yeah, I think there's inevitably differences. I think we've sort of ebbed and flowed at times between certain metrics being treated with higher levels of importance. I think lead gen has always been the leads pipeline has always been quite closely associated with our reporting metrics on the B2B side of things. I think what I would say on that is I think there is a bit more recognition now. There was almost a real appetite for everything's got to deliver leads when, people were addicted to looking at their website analytics constantly and going, right, we've got this campaign live. How many leads have come through the website? I think we've sort of managed to wean people off that a little bit now, and there's a bit more of a realization and acceptance that the long-term brand building does need to happen for that to be sustained in the long term.
Or ultimately you're going to pay more per lead, I think,
exactly.
if your brand awareness is
That's exactly it. So I think, a lot of what we're doing, and particularly on social, is almost trying to build engaged audiences who can be sold to in the right way at the right time. So yeah, I think fundamentally there are still metrics though, I think, that span the two. We're still looking at reach and relevancy of content, across social, across earned media as well. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's inevitably the kind of leads conversation, probably in the same way, we will get certain B2C brands looking at direct impact on sales in the short term as well.
Absolutely. And it's that balance of short and long-term gains, I think, and it's having that understanding of the role that each plays in the wider puzzle. I think a lot of marketing teams are very well aware of the longer term benefits of brand building, and certainly looking at those wider brand metrics as part of our measurement and reporting frameworks, looking at YouGov, prompted and unprompted brand awareness, looking at brand love, brand affinity, share of voice, all of those kind of broader metrics that indicate that the work that you're doing is shifting perception or, influencing consumer behavior. But of course, that has to be underpinned with shorter bursts of sales driving, conversion driving activity. And the two go hand in hand. And I think they can't operate effectively one can't operate effectively without the other, essentially. Ultimately, the longer term brand building piece is about improving the efficacy of what you're doing at the bottom of the funnel, and the more that you can do that and create that fertile ground, the easier it's going to be to push people over the edge and create those kind of those sales that impact the bottom line. So it's looking at the two in comparison, I think. And I'd say that maybe B2B was perhaps a little bit further behind in terms of the longer term piece, but now you're not talking about e-com products, you're not talking about click to buy a pair of trainers, you're talking about robots and expensive machinery and mechanical engineering parts. Like, these aren't things that people see a post and just click and purchase. So it's got to be a longer term process.
I think we work in industries as well in the B2B space where there's specialist sectors where there's a very finite and often quite short list of suppliers of a certain product or service. And I think that's where kind of looking at impact on share of voice becomes quite important, because I think for the marketing teams that we're working with, I think they completely recognize that a decision to buy their product or service might be a long-term one. But what they ultimately want to do is make sure that they're front of mind. So when that customer or that procurement network, if you like, are in a position where they do want to engage in a sales conversation, we're front of the queue as a brand. And I think that's where that share of voice, keeping an eye on that share of voice and trying to impact that share of voice favorably is really important.
So as we sort of start to think about summing this up, do you think the distinction between B2B and consumer marketing is shrinking? They're becoming much more aligned than they used to be.
I think there's certainly a blurring of the lines between the two. I think there's always been a perception, and it's not necessarily a conversation about strategy or creative, because I think the two are indivisible. I think you need both to be able to land impactful messages with a consumer or a B2B audience. I think there can be a perception that B2B is perhaps less creative in terms of the delivery. But I think what we are seeing more of as time has gone on is an introduction of those kind of consumer tactics, of that consumer mindset into B2B marketing. So there is more creative thinking, there is more out of the box thinking that helps to deliver that message in a really impactful way to the market. I think it's become a really crowded landscape across both consumer and B2B. The fragmentation of the media means there are more places that we can consume media. There are more brands competing. We're competing now with creators, with other brands, with other agencies, and because of that sort of attention economy, we have to shout that little bit louder sometimes for brands. It's become a lot harder to capture audience attention, even harder to retain it. So I think thinking creatively about how we land that message really impactfully has become more important, I'd say, on the B2B side, and adopting some of the techniques and the thinking from consumer marketing is becoming more and more prominent.
Yeah, and I think, to I suppose flip that on its head, I think when I look at B2C brands now, and I think that, we've always leaned quite heavily on the B2B side into people buy from people again. And I think we're seeing that rise of employee generated content, I think shows that the people buy from people mentality can apply to B2C brands as well. We're all brands are competing for often the same things, particularly in this day and age. It's credibility, it's trust, reputation, and those really define the strategies and the activity that we're delivering on a daily, weekly, monthly basis today.
And one thing we haven't talked about, actually, we've been quite separate, B2B versus B2C. There are brands, including clients of ours, who actually have to talk to both audiences. And how, that's a challenge for marketing teams. How do you best go about that? That's a huge question to ask.
It's a really good talking point. I think Dan mentioned there's a heat and a hot water sort of solutions provider that we work with, and they straddle both. They market to consumers and installers largely, and other kind of specialist sort of B2B decision makers too. And I think often it's about demonstrating demand and creating demand and playing that demand back to the other audience. So I suppose in this case, we want to create consumer demand that we can then help installers to fulfill when it comes to fitting boilers, heat pumps, etc.
It's that adage of you want to be the brand that the installer recommends and the consumer requests.
Yeah, exactly.
We need both of those things, both those levers to be working to.
It goes both ways as well, because it's also about providing that reinsurance to the installer that we're marketing to the end user. Yeah. So the installer is the ultimate decision maker in many of those transactions. They will decide to choose a particular boiler brand, but actually showing the installer that we have a presence and we're building a community with the customer, with the end user, is a really great way of providing that reassurance that we are marketing to the end user as well. And I think actually harnessing the algorithmic benefits of platforms like TikTok is a really great way of doing that, because the content will serve to the audience it's most relevant for. So we can have content that leans into more installer focused messaging. We can have interactions between the homeowner and the installer. We can have hints and tips on things that they can do to improve energy efficiency in the home that might be a little bit more geared towards the homeowner. And it doesn't feel out of place within that content ecosystem, because it all sits within a similar interest space. It can work really well for the installer to play some of that messaging back to their customers and give them opportunities to engage with their audiences directly as well.
As ever with this stuff, I think also the strategy that underpins that is really carefully thought through, because I think when we look at the audiences we're dealing with, and you look at installers, for instance, they're sole traders, they work by themselves. Is marketing and their sales pipeline a particularly prominent sort of thought that goes through their minds on a day-to-day basis? For some it will be, but I think we are trying to position the brands that we work with in those industries as being the ones that do the hard work for them. So they're creating a sales pipeline. The sell to the installer is, well, we've got a reputation, we're trusted, but also we can build a sales pipeline that you can then capitalize on.
Yeah, I think you've got to have a really clear channel strategy, haven't you? I think where it goes wrong is when you try to talk to both audiences on the same channel, and then your content appeals to everyone and no one all at the same time.
It's chaotic. Yeah, it can become a little bit confusing, I think, because it's like, who are we speaking to here? And I think the other point I would just add to this is, I suppose going back to my point earlier about earned media really sort of earning its place at the table and helping to define and shape brand narrative. And I think that can span all areas of communication across both consumer, into, we talk about corpshumer and the corporate comms side, and how that kind of brand strategy, tone of voice, messaging structure can really be amplified across different audience segments, across different channels, but still making sure that everything has that consistency and that kind of frequency of messaging. So we're adapting it for the channel, we're adapting it for the audience, but it brings everything together to create that continuity. So when people do interact with the brand, they know exactly what it stands for. And I think we are doing a lot more of that work in helping to shape that for organisations and to help bring it to life through different channels.
And what do you understand, or do you think the term corpshumer means in marketing terms?
I think corpshumer really is that kind of what would have traditionally been deemed corporate comms, reputation management. The credentials the business has, the success, its performance. I think being able to translate that to the consumer and in consumer channels, I think is how I view it. I think, like Dan says, whether you're a consumer or a B2B kind of decision maker, you are wanting to buy from, work with brands that have they're trusted, they're credible, they're on an upward trajectory at times. And I think that, to me, that's where this corpshumer kind of concept really comes in. It's not the kind of financial results type story. It's evidence of the business being invested in the right areas, the business growing through.
This being aligned with its target consumers'
Exactly
value. So,
that.
for example, a supermarket wants to tell its consumers that it has a responsible milk purchasing farm policy, for example. I'd see in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to go back to the Aldi point earlier, it's about like Aldi, yes, it does the fun stuff and it does the silly stuff. It really knows how to engage its audience, but then equally it will have a tone of voice, and it will have something that it stands for within the market. And I think it's about joining the dots in terms of those it's amplification of values, I think, is what it really brings
and that's
together.
Beautifully put, yes. Yeah. Amplification of values, I'll remember that.
It ties all of the channels together with a core purpose that it communicates to its audience consistently, and that's what makes it a strong brand, because everyone knows exactly what it stands for.
Yeah, beautifully put. Very well done. And are we seeing an increase, from our perspective, the number of briefs that come through that have got a connected B2B, B2C element, or a corpshumer element of that too?
So I think we're definitely seeing a lot more briefs in this space that go beyond just generating coverage. It's not just about driving awareness for a business anymore. It's about how we shape brand messaging, tone of voice, and reputation within the market. And that can straddle a number of different channels, a number of different specialisms. It's not necessarily something that is exclusive to B2B or consumer. It's about really defining the positioning of that brand. And I think we will start to see more of that as time goes on, and businesses really identify the value that can bring for them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that that strategy that underpins everything that we do. I think the other thing is we do work with brands and client teams who have channel specialists within their own teams as well, who might be absolutely expert at LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok. They might be brilliant at creating content, in fact. And I think what we've seen is we can work with those people in a slightly different way. It doesn't require, they don't need to outsource all of their work to us, but we can be that kind of, that guardian, that sort of shaper of the message, the narrative, tone of voice, like Dan says, and even content formats that we know through work with other clients, through possibly even work with that particular client, we know is going to land. So I think that consultative work has become really, really important, and really sets the tone for a successful collaboration between us as an agency and an in-house team as well.
So, final question of the session: what can B2B marketers learn from consumer, and vice versa? Same question to you both.
I think one thing that consumer brands can learn from B2B is, by default, B2B has always been a long game. The customer journey is a longer one from intent to purchase often. And I think as a result of that, B2B has had to operate in a way that builds that momentum over time and starts to prime its customer base. So it creates a fertile ground to help drive conversion at a later date when we're talking about a higher price point product. And I think consumer brands have started to adopt that longer term brand building mindset. So brands like Aldi, for example, that have really consistently created that fertile ground for customers in order to shift perception and drive that brand affinity. So I would say playing the long game is definitely something that can translate across both.
I'd say from the other side, I think something that B2B brands can really take from their sort of B2C counterparts is there is a lot of value in that emotional connection with your customer. I think we see B2C brands in particular use entertainment, humor really well. And I think we can't forget that people are people. Whether you're making your purchase decision within a 9 to 5 or seeing content when you sat at the sofa at home, ultimately there is a way to engage people on the channels that they consume through entertainment and just being more lighthearted, more engaging at times.
I'd agree with that. I think if you look at the B2B brands that are really flying, they are taking, certainly on social, a much more consumer take on the content they're putting out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's moving away from product USPs and specification, isn't it? It's like Nike doesn't talk about its ergonomic trainer design. It very rarely talks about its product in its marketing communications, and I think there's a lot that B2B can learn from. I'm not saying be Nike, but it's a far more aspirational, emotionally driven message that it delivers to its audience, and it makes you feel like you're part of a community. And I think that's what consumer brands do really well, is they build a community. They really drive participation with their audience, and it moves away from being broadcast and into feeling something that is a little bit more interactive and a bit more immersive. And that helps build brand connection in the long term.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for your time. I think that was fascinating.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much
Pleasure,
indeed.
thanks.